Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm joined again by Dr. Rein Müllerson, a highly accomplished Estonian academic and former advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev. Rein, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Pascal.
Thanks for saying yes. And you wrote a great piece in Russian Global Affairs, which we will discuss in the second half of the show. But first, I would like to ask you about your assessment on what is happening in Iran and how you think that the Russians, who you know quite well and who you've worked with, for a long time, and how they are approaching this situation now.
If we take such an historical long-term approach, which I believe is necessary, and in my article, which it was about Ukraine, I quoted President Mitterrand of France, because recently John Clavani, who was at that time when Mitterrand was president, he was his chief of the cabinet. And he wrote memoirs which were published in January this year. And there are many interesting things, but one was particularly important for me. It was that Mitterrand in 1990, when discussing the collapse, potential collapse of the Soviet Union and independence of Ukraine, said Ukraine becomes independent and we will have a war in Europe. So how did he know? Of course, he couldn't be certain about it, and he was not certain about it. But he knew the history. He knew the situation in Russia, certainly in the Soviet Union and in Ukraine. And therefore, he believed, I understand, I am now interpreting his words, that if not handled carefully with caution, then such a complicated country as Ukraine may drag its neighbors into the war. And this is what happened really. And now also I think that this new conflict in the Middle East, the attack by Israel and the United States against Iran, this also has such historical long-term effects. And in my opinion, this is one of these events which really accelerates this what is going on in the world today, which is the West against the rest. We can see that the West generally, with some exceptions, like the Prime Minister of Spain, for example, have willy-nilly, maybe sometimes like Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, where I live basically and where I worked and taught the last 20 years. So they have joined the United States more or less in this war of aggression. And this has contributed or accelerated this process, which had started already before. And the war in Ukraine was one of these accelerators, and we can see now the same in the case of the war between Israel and the United States on the one hand, and Iran, and many other regional states have become involved, and Europe as well, European states. So this is probably what I can, for the introduction, say about this war in the Middle East now.
Do you think that Russia do you think that this is also an emergency situation for Russia, that Iran is now being attacked and potentially a potential regime change is underway there? I mean, that is the declared goal of the United States. How do you think in the Kremlin this is being interpreted?
You know, it is a very like many things. They are complicated events. There is no simple answer. Though some experts I know say that it is very simple. Russia is an aggressor and Ukraine is a victim of an aggression. So things are not so simple. And what's going on in the Middle East, things are not so simple either. And how this would impact on Russia is not so simple. Probably in the West, it is one aspect of is emphasized that Russia has lost its allies in Venezuela, potentially in Cuba, it may be, and now Iran is under the attack, and therefore this would weaken the positions of Russia. Maybe a bit, yes, but there are several factors which I believe have different interpretation, more or less favorable for Russia. One is the first one, which seems to be quite obvious, is that there is a rise of the price of oil and gas due to this conflict because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and also because of the destruction of energy producing facilities in the Gulf states. This has already happened, and the longer the war continues, and in my opinion, it will continue quite a long time, at least several weeks, probably a month, I believe, and Iran is not going to surrender easily. Maybe Trump would like to claim a victory sooner rather than later, but I believe Iran is not ready to surrender and will continue to fight.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube. And although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video.
Then the second factor here, which seems to favor Russia, is that the Gulf states and the United States and Israel as well, their military resources, particularly there is a depletion of THAAD and patriotic missile interceptors. So they are very expensive, as I understand. One salvo costs 5 million, while Iranian drones cost $20,000 $30,000. So this means that the longer the conflict goes on, the more military hardware and software would be depleted, which now the US provides to Europe, sells to Europe, and European countries then pass it to Ukraine. And I believe some military analysts, I am not a military analyst, they believe that it cannot last very long. In any case, the United States and European countries, they have less these particularly interceptors and other military hardware. Yeah. And the third maybe factor is I don't know whether what impact it may have is that Israel and um, the United States attacked Iran while there were negotiations going on between these parties, between the United States and Iran, how to resolve this impasse, which, by the way, was partly at least created by President Trump during his first term in office when he rejected this 2015 joint comprehensive plan of action, which was concluded between five permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany on the one hand and Iran. So I believe that it is not for the first time when the West has behaved in a deceptive way. It was so with these so-called Minsk Accords, which were signed in 2015 after the coup d'etat in Kiev and the conflict, which was then more or less a civil war between two parties in Ukraine, and the West supported Kiev, while Russia supported those who had rebelled against the authorities in Kiev. These Minsk Accords, as Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, later, and President Hollande of France as well, confirmed that they were not meant to be permanent. They were meant to give Ukraine time to become stronger and then to better respond to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And of course, the West, meanwhile, sent arms and money to Ukraine to make Ukraine really stronger. And I believe in this also shows this war that you can't trust very much. Well, I don't know whether it has any additional impact because Russia and particularly President Putin is not anymore very so naive as he may have been, let's say, more than 20 years ago or more when he became the president of Russia.
But still, I mean, Russia for the entire last year during the 2025 basically was very much willing to engage with the United States diplomatically, right? We've had Mr. Putin in Anchorage, in Alaska. We've had at least 5 or so meetings between Vladimir Putin and Steve Witkoff and this entourage, this diplomatic entourage, including Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Mr. Trump. Do you think that this latest development, when the United States once again, after so many times, once again used diplomacy to try to fool the other side into complacence. They already did that back in June 2025 when they attacked Iran while the negotiations were ongoing. Now they did it again during ongoing negotiations. They did that with Russia, with the Minsk Accords, as you just said. Like time and again, the US or the West uses diplomacy as a facade in order to prepare the hard military blow toward the adversaries. And Russia seems to have been going along last year with another round of diplomatic facade. Do you think that will change now after the Iran attack?
Not necessarily, as I say, that Russia uh, is not naive, certainly hasn't been. And I understand the negotiations between the United States and Russia, they continue, or contact at least, they continue. And I understand soon again, probably in Switzerland, in Geneva, maybe in other places, there will be a new meeting. This is my understanding, and this hasn't been cancelled, and Russia is not going to cancel it, certainly. And I understand that, of course, Russia doesn't want to antagonize Trump very much. Either one of the reasons is. And Russia hopes that Trump would put pressure on Ukraine to have this, what may be called, and there was a UN article in the Foreign Affairs. It was a bit more than a week ago, and the contacts certainly are continuing. And my understanding is that this war against Iran, this is a war on behalf of Israel. And I don't remember exactly how many times Netanyahu visited Washington or Florida in recent this year, meeting Trump there and persuading, I understand, him to attack Iran. And it seems that Trump was not very enthusiastic at the beginning, and particularly the Vice President J.D. Vance is, in my opinion, very unhappy with this war. And you can see now in the United States internally, not only Democrats and many Republicans, and the people as a whole are against this conflict, this war against Iran. It is not in the interest of the United States. In that case, this is the tail which is wagging the dog, as it is said sometimes. Although in this case, who knows who is the dog and who is the tail here, really, because of Israeli lobby in the United States. And I believe Russia is interested in these negotiations, and the best outcome would be, and in my article I write about three scenarios of possible endgame in Ukraine. And the first one is, of course, a negotiated agreement and trading land for peace. And in that, this is the best for Ukraine and for Russia, and also for Europe, of course. Though the problem with it is that in that case, it would be seen as a victory for Russia, and Ukraine, the leadership, particularly President Zelensky, would doesn't like such an outcome, which would be seen as a victory for Russia, and Ukrainian European allies especially are against it. So I I don't know. Therefore, whether these negotiations succeed, but I believe that President Trump and wants to have this conflict in Europe ending in order to concentrate on other issues, because the most important aim was to face China in the Far East, and now the United States is bogged down in the Middle East, and it is still also involved in the European conflict. This is not in the interest of the United States, certainly. Therefore, I believe that it is still possible that this conflict in Ukraine would be resolved, notwithstanding what is going on in the Middle East. And it may be even that if the conflict lasts longer, in such a case, maybe a solution for the Ukrainian conflict would come more easily also, because of the factors I described earlier.
Right. So let's use this as a way to actually talk about your article, which I've got here with me. You wrote, I mean, it carries a very nice title, From Kissinger's Nightmare to European Quagmire, Divide et Impera in US Foreign Policy. And you're making that argument that the United States is using the strategy right now, divide and conquer or divide and rule, and is that the entire way in which the United States approaches the Ukraine war actually points toward the way that it wants to implement foreign policy, right? I highlighted a couple of memorable quotes. The first one being, as America tolerates only vassalized allies, incipient Russo-American rapprochement came to an end after the disastrous 1990s, once Russia began to emerge from its coma and demanded respect. Can you maybe talk to this a little bit? The reason why the United States or NATO were never able or never willing to actually truly integrate Russia and make it an equal partner.
Yeah. I believe in the 1990s, Russia was also in the situation which has only occurred quite rarely, in my opinion, 3 times in the history of Russia. President Putin, I don't remember exactly the words, of course, now, but in 2012, he said that most of the times Russia has led independent foreign policy. So most of the time. And there have been times, for example, it was called, these times, the first I recall, were at the beginning of the 17th century, when the Poles had attacked and taken Moscow, even, and they were called troubled times. Then this period is called in Russia. So Russia was at the brink of a collapse. Then, then it was the Bolshevik Revolution and that period also, where Russia was invaded by the Brits, also from Murmansk, from the north. And then the third was the period which started under Gorbachev, when still the Soviet Union was existed, and I don't remember you mentioned that I was Gorbachev's advisor on international law, and so I was in Moscow, and I didn't really scare it very well. Gorbachev was a bit really naive, uh, uh, trusting the West, not requesting written confirmations for these promises which were made, not to enlarge NATO and inch to the east and so on. And then the President Yeltsin, already the Russian Federation, was also on the brink of the collapse almost, or losing its independence, because this was a period of what's called oligarchization. Oligarchs ruled and forced the hand of President Yeltsin, and the Western firms also tried to have their hands on resources, particularly energy resources in Russia. And there were attempts of disintegration in the Caucasus particularly, but in some other places as well. So Russia was really in a coma in a way before the year 2000, when Putin became president of Russia. So, and why the West didn't want Russia to become a member of NATO, for example. Because this was what Yeltsin had offered, and Putin as well when he became president. I believe Russia is too big to be, let's say, swallowed like other countries. And in my opinion, also at that time, during the Cold War, also at the end of the Cold War, in the West, particularly in the United States, there were more experts, advisors who knew quite well Russia. Because now I don't see such people at all.
Right.
Some those who called experts of Russia, they are simply Russophobes. They hate Russia, and therefore they believe that they know Russia. And they don't know at all. I lived there 25 years, and though I speak Russian with an accent, probably better than most Russians, true nevertheless. So I believe I know Russia, though I am not an expert on Russia simply because of my background. I understand. And therefore, then you can't have two from the point of view of the United States, which tolerates only vassalized allies, to vassalize Russia, it would have been much more difficult, and therefore it would be preferable either to keep Russia out and then try to weaken Russia or to exploit its resources. And this is why Russia would have been equal or then co-president of the NATO. Like, let's say, you can't have China in such regional security organization together with the United States. It would be really then, let's say, if China, Russia, and the United States, India also would be in one international security organization, then there will be much more. The world will be much more secure, of course, in that case. But this would mean that the United States cannot dictate its policies within these organizations.
Yeah, and there we have the big problem, of course. I mean, the word, all of these hopeful visions of the future of the Eurasian continent, including a hopeful vision for Russia to be part of NATO, and NATO basically becoming a military arm of the OSCE, and doing real collective security together, like the security the Russian way imagines it, where the security of one cannot go at the expense of the other, and you have a structure, a proper architecture. But that's not what NATO is there for. That's not its purpose. So it was definitely rejected. And you have another very nice quote in your or a very explanatory passage there that reads that by arming Ukraine and making it a de facto NATO member, but without Article 5 guarantees, the West was not only playing with fire, but deliberately dragging Russia into Ukraine. Today, the Americans have apparently judged that millions of Ukrainian lives are less historically important than the collapse of vassalization-resistant Russia. Can you explain this one a little bit?
Of course, one may say that maybe the United States and its European allies behaved recklessly, not thoughtfully enough, expanding NATO to the borders of Russia, and then including Ukraine. Also Georgia and Ukraine, particularly Ukraine, of course. Ukraine and Kiev particularly has very important emotional aspects for both Russians, I believe. The Kiev and Rus started there in both Ukraine and Russia, claim that their roots are there, while Ukraine denies that Russian roots are there. Russian roots are more come from Mongolia and from Tatars in the east. Okay, this is a complicated matter. I believe it's also interesting that Russia is a very complicated country, and in that way, it is also a civilizational entity, like maybe China, India, and Russia, and or maybe some other big countries as well. While the United States is a country, a state of migrants,
Right.
uh, and therefore unique. While European countries, and this is a problem for Europe, in my opinion, European countries are nation states. The concept and practice of nation states relatively small if you compare with other parts of the world. This is the concept and practice is started in Europe. At that time, it was very beneficial. European, these consolidated nation states, they had their colonies, exploited them, became rich and also powerful economically and military. But now this time is over. Sorry, I now became distracted by probably the
because you have this sentence there. I mean, you do this analysis in your piece where you're saying that the grand strategy of the United States always was about the big picture, right? And you use the example. Wait, sorry, I should be here. You use the example of Brzezinski, who once was asked if he regrets, having armed the Taliban against the Soviet Union, and his reply was like, well, what was more important, a few radical Islamists or the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And in this sense, the United States is currently using Ukraine as its implementation partner of its strategy to break up Russia, right?
Yeah. So as I said, it may be that yes, the United States didn't take Russia very seriously as equal partner, because Russia was really very weak in the 1990s, particularly at the end of the 1990s, the financial collapse in 1998 as well, and so on. And now you referred to Brzezinski, and I quote him really. And in this interview he gave in 1998, it was not only that they had armed the Taliban um, and Al Qaeda, not the Taliban, then they had armed Al Qaeda and other Islamist forces in Afghanistan who fought the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, which foolishly, in my opinion, went to Afghanistan. What was important in this interview by Brzezinski was that Brzezinski said that President Carter and I myself, we wanted the Soviet Union to have its own Vietnam. They invited, by helping the Islamist opponents of the government of Afghanistan, which was more or less friendly with the Soviet Union. It was not a communist government. So the Communist Party, probably even true, if I remember correctly, existed then in Afghanistan. But the government, yes, was relatively loyal or friendly towards the Soviet Union. And therefore, they invited, dragged the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. And I believe that the same may have been the purpose also in Ukraine. Not necessarily initially. I don't think that this was a long-term matter. But then, after the coup d'etat of 2014, and when the rearmament of Ukraine was under the way, also, the OSCE observers, and this is documented, they show that in February, before the 24th of February, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the bombardment by the Kiev forces of these territories in Donbass accelerated greatly. And taking into account also some statements by President Zelensky, Russia may have believed really that Kiev is now going to take back these rebel territories in Donbass. So, and therefore, Russia started its special military operation, as it is called, and the West calls it equally doggedly as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It was not a full-scale. Probably it is today a full-scale conflict already going on the territory of Ukraine. But at that time, it was really a very limited military operation, and the main aim was to force Ukraine to abide by Minsk agreements, to remain neutral. And this neutrality would have been guaranteed, partly at least, by autonomy of this Donbas region. Because they were Russophones and Russophiles and simply Russians, mostly living there. And in that case, if they had more autonomy, they wouldn't have allowed then Ukraine to join NATO. This was, in my opinion, one of the purposes of Russia when these Minsk Accords were signed. And then the negotiations followed almost immediately, first in Belarus and then in Istanbul, yes, and in April already they had agreed basically that Ukraine will become neutral country, and these territories, rebel territories, then it was not Zaporozhye, it was not Kherson, other parts, it was only two oblasts or regions, Luhansk and Donetsk regions. They would remain parts of Ukraine, but with certain control and a little bit Russian language, the official language, also. And even state of the Crimea would respond to treaty, tiny.
May I just add, like the agreement was so friendly to the Ukrainian interests that even the negotiator, the Ukrainian side's negotiator, famously said he couldn't really believe that the Russians were willing to give concede all of these points. But then we know what happened next with Boris Johnson coming in and saying, like, you should reject that. And one of my main frustrations was that, of course, the core of this argument of this agreement would have been the neutrality of Ukraine, and that neutrality of Ukraine would actually also have preserved the neutrality of Finland and the neutrality of Sweden, and it would have enforced neutrality in Moldova, right? It would have just proven that the concept is here to de-escalate, right? And that it works, that these buffer states then create security on all sides. But that was explicitly torpedoed by the West in order to then have this horrible war of attrition that we now see.
This also shows, in my opinion, that the West really wanted at least the West is also obligated. So there are different voices of opinion. But there were those who wanted to drag Russia really into Ukraine and to weaken thereby Russia using Western money and weapons and Ukrainian men and women. And also I can add when I saw on TV these negotiations starting in Istanbul, I was optimistic because of one specific, for me, reason. And it was that I saw my friend, Alexander Charvey, who was a member of the delegation behind the desk, and a member of the negotiating team from Ukraine. He had written before And I knew him personally well during the Soviet periods. He was young scholar in Kiev. I was in Moscow. We were students almost at the same time, and we communicated always very well, visited each other. And he has also written, I don't remember when, an article about the neutrality of Ukraine, that Ukraine should remain neutral. And in my article, I published an article already in March or April 2014 in one of the Oxford University journals, and the title was "Ukraine: A Victim of Geopolitics."
Yeah.
And I knew not only Russia, I know Russia better, of course, but I knew Ukraine quite well as well. I had been there. I have very close friends among Ukrainians, and Alexander Charlie was one of them. And it's a very complicated country, which has been part of Polish-Lithuanian Empire, then Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire, of course. And it is not impossible to have a state out of these parts, and Switzerland probably is one of the great examples. And Sweden, Finland maybe, where the Swedes and Finns live together already for centuries. Well, but one has to, there are at least two conditions then necessary. One, responsible leaders who take interest of the state building seriously. But Ukraine has never had such leaders. None of the presidents has been of person such caliber. Zelensky was elected because he was to have peace with Russia, to end the conflict, yes, and I believe he genuinely may have believed, but there were not very big, but very powerful and vocal forces, nationalistic forces in Ukraine, and there were forces in the West which didn't want Ukraine to be neutral, but to be with the West, and then Russia would have been, as Brzezinski also famously said, with Ukraine, Russia will be an empire. Without Ukraine, it will be a, let's say, regional state.
Yeah, and we know all of that today. There's no more there are no more mysteries about this. Even Victoria Nuland went on TV later on. Of course, she was in 2014. She was on the Maidan. She then later became the Undersecretary of State, and later, I think in 2014, 2024 or 25, she gave that interview in which she said, the agreements that were almost created in Istanbul, they were not acceptable because they would have, and she used the word neutered Ukraine, right? So she uses a very, very disrespectful term in order to describe that concept. But it really describes the bubble of these people, including, of course, then other neoconservatives who do view everybody as a tool to implement great power ambitions. But that brings me to my last point, which is the Europeans, the very sad and sorry role the Europeans are playing. And you have here this toward the end of the piece, you've got this quote saying that after blindly following Washington into containing Russia, after sacrificing Ukraine on the altar of Washington's geopolitical ambitions, Europe will be left with only two options: to live with a strong Russia as its neighbor, or to fight it. And This is a very sad and scary conclusion. Which one do you think the Europeans are going to choose? I agree. I completely agree with the assessment.
At the moment, it seems that the European states, with some few exceptions, they are preparing for the war with Russia.
Yeah.
And okay, you may really strengthen your security and increase military budgets, but then negotiate also, as it was done during the Cold War. And this prevented then the Cold War becoming a hot war between the Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies. Because, yes, they militarized their economies, but then particularly after the Caribbean crisis or Cuban crisis of 1962, they started negotiating and concluding treaties on disarmament treaties and treaties, agreements which increased trust between superpowers. And then, but today we cannot see any proposals from the part of the European leaders how to live with Russia. Yes, some say we have first to end the war in Ukraine, but they are fueling this conflict in Ukraine in order to prolong the agony of Ukraine. And therefore, at the moment, it seems that the first scenario, which is that they were somehow also dragged into this geopolitical conflict by the United States, and they were willingly like vassals to following the United States in most of the cases, enthusiastically sometimes even. But Russia is there where it is, and therefore it is inevitable that they have either to fight Russia or to live with Russia. And of course, this last scenario is preferable, and I hope that new generation of leaders in Europe, and there are some already in some countries. I follow of course, the British. The British have not seen any signs, but I follow Italian and French channels also. There are forces which favor contact with Russia and negotiations with Russia. So I still hope that it is possible that Russia will become part of Europe as it has been. And my article was also inspired by this, that one of the purposes of aims of the United States was to drive a wedge between Europe and Russia, particularly already during the years of President General de Gaulle in France, which spoke about Europe from the Urals to Lisbon. And then, of course, when particularly Germany started this Eastern policy and buying energy resources, oil and gas from Russia. So the United States was always unhappy and tried to do a lot in order to prevent this rapprochement between Russia and Europe. And then European leaders, German chancellors particularly, they were not vassals of the United States as current leaders have been.
Yeah. No, I mean the history of what happened over the last 30 years during the unipolar moment to me shows that, while normal nation states learn how to enlist their population for their military purposes, hegemonic powers learn how to enlist foreign states and their militaries for their purposes. And the Europeans have been enlisted and the Ukrainians have been enlisted. And, you need the will to fight in order to fight a war. And they managed to create that. You create the environment in which you then have the people who will run with the guns toward the enemy. It's a very sad development, and I fear that the next line of offense might be actually the Europeans in that scenario to fight Russia. Rein, thank you very much for this very brilliant expose of your thoughts in this article. Anyone who wants to find it, it's available for free on the internet. You can find it on the homepage of Russia and Global Affairs. It carries the title From Kissinger's Nightmare to European Quagmire: Divide et Impera in U.S. Foreign Policy. Rein Müllerson, thank you very much for your time today.
For having me, always it is a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you, Pascal. Bye.